your views, your values. This is WMNF Tampa 88.5 FM.
This is an important... You are tuned to WMNF Radio 88.5 FM. This is a public affairs program called Community Speaks. I'm your host, Patro Mabili. And Banned Books Week has gotten underway. More than 8,000 books were pulled just in Florida, in the state of Iowa alone, where laws restricting the content of books have been passed. And that's not all we're going to talk about. At the UN, world leaders try to lay out a vision for the future and actually make it happen. The United Nations Human Rights Chief also calls for an investigation into the pager and the walkie-talkie explosions in the Middle East. And the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, of course, as I said, is calling for an investigation, saying that, these events surrounding exploding pagers that killed at least 12 people in Syria and Lebanon, these simultaneous targeting of thousands of individuals without knowing who held the devices or their locations, violated international human rights law and possibly international humanitarian law, according to the UN High Commissioner, Volker Turk. So maybe we'll get a chance to listen to Norman Finkelstein. He's an American political scientist and activist. His primary fields of research are the politics of the Holocaust and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Finkelstein was born in New York City to Jewish Holocaust survivor parents. And he came here to the University of South Florida maybe a couple of weeks ago. We got some of those comments that maybe we could play for you today. Of course, that was before the explosions of the pagers. But how that happened is interesting. We'll see. Maybe talk to people we've been reading a little bit about how you would have to control the supply networks of pagers and walkie-talkies going to that area in the Middle East in order to basically put the explosive devices inside them. So interesting to see how Israel was able to pull that off. But of course, it does increase, it puts a different spin on what warfare really is and whether or not war crimes were committed in the process. But of course, it has raised the stakes in the Middle East. The strikes on Lebanon continues to this day, and so we'll probably hear more about those events and this widening conflict as the day goes on, to listen to Dr. Finkelstein, his comments. But also we'll get to some of the politics of this country and around the world. As I said, there are a lot of people making their way to polls around the world, and they've been trying to make their choices for who will be their leaders. But there's been some discussion about how democracy is actually in decline. So we'll talk about that. But in Sri Lanka, we saw democracy go the other way, not more conservative or more fascist, but a Marxist politician has won the election in Sri Lanka. So it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward there. But this Marxist politician named Anaru Dissanayake, he won the Sri Lanka's presidential election over the weekend. In doing so, dealt a blow to the political old guard, and has been widely blamed, that old guard has been widely blamed for the unprecedented economic crisis that hit the South Asian island nation 2 years ago. This new president, whose pro-working class populist campaign won him youth support and secured victory over opposition leaders. This new president is the leader of the coalition headed by a Marxist political party that waged two unsuccessful armed insurrections in the 1970s and the 1980s to capture power through socialist revolution. And I don't know why we continuing to hear our Rick Scott of Florida, who's a senator in the United States Senate representing Florida, continue to run his campaign by calling his opponent, his Democratic opponent, a socialist. But I do believe that is code terminology for the Cuban and Venezuelan communities here in Florida that he thinks is triggered by that word, because the things that he's accusing his opponent of doing that is socialist is far from socialist. So this is a code terminology to be anti-immigrant and speak to an immigrant community at the exact same time. It's just one of those tricks of the trade politically on the right-wing side in this country, and especially in this state. We could probably talk about what these dog whistles do and talk about a little politics going on in the state. New laws are taking shape starting October 1st in this state, and one of the most controversial would be the no sleeping outdoors, basically anti-homeless law that is intended to capture the homeless in one place and probably make it easier to, they say, make it easier to get services to them. But some people say it just make it easier to criminalize homelessness. But we could talk about all of those issues. And of course, you know, we are looking at the presidential campaign in this country as Vice President Kamala Harris has raised $27 million in a New York fundraiser over the weekend. She would plans to deliver a speech, economic speech, Wednesday, outlining her economic vision, saying there's more that we can do to invest in the aspirations and the ambitions of the American people while addressing the challenges that they face. She cited the high cost of home ownership and stubbornly high grocery bills as examples. And also going forward, just one more announcement, there's going to be a voter registration to turn out, actually a dinner by the NAACP. But the speakers, who's important, I would like to go and hear him speak and maybe bring some of those comments to you. But Yusef Salam, who was one of the exonerated members of the Central Park 5, this was the group of boys back in 30 years ago that were accused of raping a woman in Central Park. But the real rapist eventually confessed. But even before and after the confession, the former president, 45, put out a full-page ad calling for these teenagers to be put to death. And there had not been a trial, and there was no proof. Just this confession, these confessions from teenagers who were just scared, and of course it was coerced out of them, hopefully in hopes that the police hoping they could just shut the case with them. But even when the real killer and DNA were exposed, the ex-president 45 never took down that full-page ad or apologized for it. So the fact that he's on the ballot this November, he says if he loses, he won't run again. So let's make that happen so that we can finally turn the page on that. But of course, there are going to be other politicians, especially emanating out of the state of Florida, we'll have to keep our eye on. But this is Community Speaks here on your community radio station, WMNF. My name is Patro Mobili, your host for this program, and would like to hear from you. You can always call, because this is an opportunity for me to talk to you. You can call me at 813-239-9663. That's 813-239-9663. DJ Spaceship stands ready to take your telephone calls to get us started here on the show today. But you can also write me an email, writing at djwmf.org. And, of course, you can also continue to show your support for Community Speaks and for this midday public affairs. You know, you can go online at wmf.org and give us a donation there. I still didn't reach the goal, so you could help put me over the top on that point. But give us a call to get on the air today to talk about what is happening around the world. There's so many things, but looking at what has happened in the United Nations, in the Middle East, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, this past week called for an independent investigation into the events surrounding exploding pagers that killed at least 12 people in Syria and Lebanon. And as we're seeing the fighting picking up there in the Middle East. And we're going to listen to a little bit of Dr. Norman Finkelstein, who came to the University of South Florida a couple of weeks ago to talk about the politics of that conflict. And we'll take a listen to that real quick. Here, we won't listen to all of the comments, but just the opening comments that Norman Finkelstein rendered to the University of South Florida. We know that over the weekend, over the last spring, and before the semester ended last year, that college students had made the conflict in the Middle East, in the plight of the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, their cause célèbre, and took to campuses to protest, and sometimes even in the surrounding neighborhoods off campus. And they got in a lot of trouble. A lot of presidents of colleges had to resign, lost their jobs by not allowing the protest to go forward, or some students were held, their diplomas were held up, not given to them simply because they protested. So that was a chilling effect on protests, but of course there was a lot of anger at what Hamas had done, taking hostages of non-combatants, of civilians, just going about their day, some at a concert. And so there was a lot of people taking sides, but the students said that it was a matter of human rights, and the fact that there's overt violence, the killing that is taking place on Gaza, was anathema to their sensibilities. So they took to protest. But let's listen to what Dr. Norman Finkelstein said to the University of South Florida this past couple of weeks ago about the conflict in Gaza and the overall conflict between Palestinians and Israel. Keep it tuned here to Community Speaks, and we'll talk to you later about some of the other political issues facing us this election season and in this state.
I think logically the place to begin is where Gaza began, where Gaza became Gaza, which is in 1948, during what's usually called the First Arab-Israeli War. In the course of that war, about 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from the area that became the State of Israel. And of those 750,000, approximately 300,000, a little bit less, I think the normal number given is 280,000, they were expelled into the area that became Gaza. They comprised about 80% of the population, about roughly 20% were indigenous to Gaza, and about 80% were Palestinians who were expelled during the 1948 war. So the first fact to remember about Gaza is it's an overwhelmingly refugee population. About 80% now are categorized under international standards. 80% of the people are categorized as refugees or descendants of refugees. And the other fact, which always has to be borne in mind, is that Gaza is overwhelmingly, not overwhelmingly, it's half a child population. About, right now you'd say about 1,250,000 of the 2.3 million people of Gaza are classified under international standards as children. So it's overwhelmingly a refugee population, and it's overwhelmingly a child population. Gaza itself is a relatively tiny parcel of land. It's 26 miles long, which for those of you who run the marathon, it's the length of a marathon. And it's about 5 miles wide, which is roughly the distance, not exactly the distance, I jog every morning. So it's a very tiny place. It was, up until October 7th, it was usually classified as among the most densely populated places on Earth, more densely populated than Tokyo. But now it's by a very wide margin, it's now the most densely populated place on Earth because half the population has been expelled to the south. And even of the south, about 1/4 of the south is where the population is concentrated. So as of this moment, one can say it's by a wide margin the most densely populated place on God's earth. Gaza came under, after the 1948 war, Gaza came under what was called the administrative control of Egypt. That is, Egypt occupied the territory, but it never annexed the territory. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan. Jordan renounced the annexation in 1988, but Gaza was never formally annexed by Egypt. The conditions in Gaza were already quite horrific under the Egyptian administration. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Jamie Stern-Weiner, he recently brought to my attention that already UN officials in Gaza in 1955, so this is long before the Israeli occupation, already in 1955, they were describing Gaza as a concentration camp. Up until 1967, as I said, Gaza was under Egyptian control, and during the 1967 war, Gaza then came under Israeli control. But even before it came under Israeli control formally, there were quite a lot of massacres carried out by Israel in Gaza. So to take the most well-known example, in 1956, Israel, along with the United Kingdom and France, they invaded Egypt. And as I mentioned, Gaza was under Egyptian control at the time. And when Israel entered Gaza during the 1956 war, it conducted several large-scale massacres in places which are probably familiar to many people in the room right now. For example, in Khan Yunis, there was a very large massacre. In Rafah, there were a very large massacre. And the massacres were actually quite reminiscent of what goes on now. They took several hundred young Palestinian men and just lined them up and shot them down. Also, right after the 1948 war, many people had stories to tell like Dima mentioned a few moments ago. The Palestinians who were expelled were wedded to their homes, they were wedded to their land, and they were wedded to their neighbors and families. And so many of them weren't yet resigned to the fact that they had lost their homeland. And so large numbers attempted to return to their homes. And of those large numbers, the estimates are between 2,700 and 5,000 Palestinians, both from Gaza and from the West Bank. About between 2,700 and 5,000. They had no weapons. They were not terrorists, to use the term. They were simply trying to return to their homes, in many cases to harvest their fields. And they were not just murdered, but murdered in quite brutal, torturous ways. For those of you who might be interested, there's actually a quite good book on the subject by an Israeli, the historian Benny Morris, and the book is called Israel's Border Wars. It's well worth reading, even for myself, who has become, you might say, jaded or inured to atrocities. It was quite shocking what he had to describe. The problem with Benny Morris is it seems that he's suffering now from amnesia. He's forgotten everything he said, and whenever you quote him, he says, "I didn't say that." Well, he did. Come 1967, Israel occupies Gaza as well as the West Bank. And the people in Gaza were not resigned to coming under Israeli occupation. There was an element of resistance. And in 1970, the commander of the southern Israeli South, his name was Ariel Sharon, he then entered Gaza and committed large-scale massacres there, large-scale deportations of Palestinians, but also large-scale killings. So, as you can imagine, given the history, you start with the expulsions in 1948. You have the massacres in 1956. You have the repression in 1970. As you can imagine, there was, if we can use the expression, already an accumulation of bad blood between the people of Gaza and the state of Israel.
Listening to Dr. Norman Finkelstein, his comments at the University of South Florida. He was just going over the history since 1948 of the Gaza Strip and Israel, the Israelis' relationship as it came into being with the people in the Middle East. And so we're seeing an escalation and widening of the violence after what we saw happen on October 7th, and of course last week after the explosion of pagers and walkie-talkies, sort of James Bondization of the conflict. People have been trying to figure out how they were able to control the supply chain and get that done. But the UN chief says it was a war crime. And but we're going to talk about what else is happening at the United Nations as world leaders try to lay out a vision for the future and actually try to make that happen. And maybe before we get out, we'll have an opportunity to listen to more of Dr. Finkelstein's comments. But we want to get to some of the politics of today, what's happening. And of course, that conflict in Israel, people are not calling it a war yet. So is this war? Is Israeli Hezbollah conflict is actually hard to define and hard to predict after what we saw happen, especially. But Israel is bombing targets across many parts of Lebanon. So talking about possible widening of this conflict more than just Hamas, but with Hezbollah and striking senior militants in Beirut and apparently hiding bombs and pagers and walkie-talkies, as we said. But no one is calling it a war, not yet. Israeli officials say they are not seeking war with Hezbollah and that it can be avoided if the militant group halts its attacks and backs away from the border. Hezbollah also says it doesn't want a war, but it is prepared for one, and that it will keep up the strikes on Israel that it began in the wake of Hamas's October 7th attack, and until there is a ceasefire in Gaza. So Israel and Hezbollah have repeatedly traded fire since then, but the intensity rose to another level this past Monday when Israeli airstrikes killed more than 270 people, according to Lebanese officials. And that would make it the deadliest day in Lebanon since Israel and Hezbollah last went to war in 2006. So, of course, this is going to require some attention from whoever occupies the White House. And we're in the middle of a campaign to find out who that will be. And in the meantime, states have to deal with our issues. And as I said earlier, this is Banned Books Week has started with mixed messages as report shows. Challenges are both up and down. There are two reports that provide a mixed but compelling outlook on the wave of book removals and challenges as the annual Banned Books Week begins. For schools, for stores, and libraries nationwide, the American Library Association found a substantial drop in 2024 so far in complaints about books stocked in public school and academic libraries, but PEN America is documenting an explosion in books being removed from school shelves in 2023 through 2024 school year, tripling to more than 10,000 over the previous year, and more than 8,000 were pulled just in Florida, in Iowa, where laws restricting the content of books have been passed. So we're going to go to the telephone lines as you have started calling in. 813-239-9663 is the number to call. We'll get to more of the surveys and findings as Banned Book Week gets underway. And we'll talk about some of the politics in this country and on the globe as we move forward. But I want to turn to you as we are taking your telephone calls here on Community Speaks. I'm your host, Patro Mobili, and this is an opportunity for you to talk back to your radio. And we'll go to Daryl in Tampa, find out what's on your mind, Daryl.
Good afternoon, Mobili.
Afternoon.
Yeah, I'm breaking a rule right now, but I promise I'm going to try to stay on point of what I was told not to do because I don't want to attract any thing. Well, we don't know. I just want to say here's an old saying. The first conflict in any conflict is the truth. Let me say this. Let me clear my throat. The first victim in any conflict is the truth. So they want to ban books. I'll simply say this. Does that mean you want to take away Black history?
Yeah.
You can't make me forget. Unfortunately, I was born in a household of teachers. Some who went to Bethune-Cookman College, now university. Some went to FAMU, which has the most extensive collection of Black history in the United States. That sounds just like a conflict of interest until November comes. We all family until November. Y'all can't have none of our turkey. We're going to see how the conflict going to end. But you wonder, how do we get people like Donald Trump, who says, like, he wished his generals could have been more like the German generals. You mean like Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, like Hermann Goering, who was over the German Air Force, who conspired together to send a bomb to him to try to kill him, because they wanted to kill him because he going off and making all these crazy decisions, and they were trying to win the war, so they figured they had to kill him, and the only thing that saved him was a heavy tabletop. You mean, how do we get people like Donald Trump? Or how do we get people like Rick Scott? Remember him? Maybe we ought to try some new ideas. Remember him when he was governor? Wore boots with boots with symbols on the side of his boots. One was the Confederate flag, and one was the American flag. You mean him? And then the governor who preceded him, what's his name? Ron DeSantis? You mean Mr. Anti-Vax? Yeah. Vaccine, which put a lot of your children in danger of diseases. You mean him? And some other lovely decisions that he come down the pike with? Oh, I know there are a lot of causes. I don't want to take up your time, Billy. No. And I don't want to get in trouble. You got something you want to say?
No, you're not going to get in trouble talking to me about these truths. And
oh, my God. Let me hush. Yeah, him. That's probably not his name. Want to be a dentist in Lakeland, the seat of the Ku Klux Klan. Bye, Billy.
Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Daryl, for putting it out there. And that's the situation in Florida, the political situation that we have. How do we get these people? And how do they continue to get support? And does their code terminology campaigns actually work for enough people that they can continue to hold power? And at a time when, people are trying to solve problems, and these guys are continuing to scapegoat people and basically replay old history, old fascist history, and as if nobody hears it. So I think it's important to ask ourselves, how do we get these politicians, and how are they still competitive? 813-239-9663 is the number to call. Given all they've done and said, how is it that we are still stuck with them? Let's go to Mentisnot in Tampa. How are you doing? Thank you for calling.
I'm doing just fine. How you doing? Uhuru, brother. How you doing?
Uhuru. Pretty good.
That's good. It's good to hear you. Good to hear your voice. Call ourselves listening to the gentleman that you brought on that spoke at USF.
Yeah.
And he talked about the war, about 1948 war. I want to say this. I want to be clear on something. Since 1860, it's only been 4 wars. That's Civil War, World War I, World War II, but really 3 wars. But all that other stuff that they call in wars, like Vietnam and what happened over in Indonesia and then Korean War and all this other stuff, those weren't wars at all, period. What's happening right now in occupied Palestine, that's not a war at all. Those are massacres, plain and simple. They do a provocation, and after the provocation, they do a massacre after that. There's no such thing as Hamas. There's no such group in the world that ever existed as Hamas. All this other stuff that they talk about, that's stuff that the white folks create, and then they control it, and whensoever they're ready to do whatsoever they're ready to do, then they go ahead and do it. When people say, how is it that the ruling, that the people that they vote into office, or Donald Trump or whatsoever, Donald Trump is basically the temperature and the pulse of white people, period. White people, period. They don't care what this man did. And that's like with anybody else that carries on white nationalism. They don't care what they did. The people that ain't care what Hitler did or what he didn't do or what he was about to do. That's the ambition. That's just the manifestation of white folks, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. Because you can't be out there and getting millions and millions and millions of votes because they can swing it either way. They can say democracy, autocracy. They can say whatsoever they want to say. Fascism. They can call it whatsoever they want to call it, but it's white nationalism, plain and simple. It's controlled and it's ruled by the ruling class, and they run it the way they want to run it. The people, if they put all the books in the school, if they took all the books out of the school, it's not going to make a difference. Most black people can't read or write. Most black people cannot read or write. Probably 98, 99% of black people can't read or write.
I don't know if that's true, but I get your point.
I understand what you're saying, and you know, all I speak is facts. 98 to 99% of Africans internationally, all over the world, cannot read or write and definitely can't comprehend. 99% of Africans, if you talk to any African person, if you went to any high school right now, if you went to any college and pick out any smart person, pick out 100 black people and tell them write something or give them something to read and comprehend. Man, I got kids in elementary school, middle school, high school, and college, and none of them have a lick of sense. None of them, as far as reading, writing, comprehend. If you give a black child something to write and say, hey, write this, and watch their handwriting, you would think it's somebody pre-kindergarten that's doing that. And that's another subject matter right there. But if they put all the books in the school, now you'll be surprised if you talk to black people how little we know. You'll be surprised. It's a dilemma.
Well, we have heard the statement that if you want to hide the truth, put it in a book. So, but I think that's the whole purpose of librarians, why they're coming under attack. Apparently, they want people to read, but there are politicians who don't want people's minds open and are taking advantage of this lack of interest in reading. So I do understand your point, but I think that this is why people work so hard to bring truth and speak truth to power.
Well, you know, I would say this, and, you know, I'll be very clear about this. I don't care how you put information out there. I don't care how you put books out there. The people really taking your mind, those things that the politicians are going after in their Project 2025. You know, I got Project 1200 that I'm writing about right now, and that's going to be part of my book, which is called I Am My Ancestors and Future Generations Representative, which is going to be in the Project 1200 book, which calls for basically solving this immigration problem by ultimately sending all these white people back to Europe, putting them back to 1200 where they were. But the fact of the matter is, all this stuff where they talking about black jobs, black this, that, black education, all that, with artificial intelligence, that's not going to matter. You know, these people don't have any use, you know, like for bodies, period, because artificial intelligence can do that. So you're going to see it's a changing world. So those things is of no significance one way or another. And, you know, want to reiterate what I stated. 98 to 99% of black people cannot read or write. That's internationally.
Hey, well, let me go ahead and get some more people on the phone. Thank you, Batizna. It was good to hear your voice again. And maybe we'll talk more when you publish that book. Let's see. We got full phone lines right now. And let's see what others have to say. William is on the road in Florida. William, thank you for calling. Community Speaks. You say what?
Well, I think that gentleman was a little high in his estimate, but just based on experiences I've had. But what I really wanted to talk about, and I have to again say I disagreed with the gentleman before, is that number one, the partition when it was originally done, the partition of Palestine, was basically illegal. It was the European powers that partitioned it because they could. And they just made it legal because they could make it legal. You know, that old thing about might makes right. But the war, it actually is a war. And that's what everybody has to understand. I mean, this is what I believe. that everybody should understand that it is a war. It has been going on since the 1940s, when the Jewish population originally went into Palestine. There were conflicts with their Arab neighbors, and the British would not arm the Israelis, and they specifically asked for arms and everything to protect themselves. How strong a problem there was never really addressed, but that was what they wanted. There was an organization called the Irgun, which is now the Mossad, and it was headed by many of the people that are now the leaders of the Israeli government. And I think there needs to be a distinction made between the Israelis and Zionism. That Zionism is the militaristic, antagonistic group that is taking over all the land. They've been just bulldozing people's houses illegally. The UN has condemned it, told them it was illegal. They just ignored it. I feel like the Zionists are, after World War II, they went, everybody's trying to kill us, so we can do whatever we want. We have to consider everybody to be an enemy, and we can do whatever we want because it is a war for survival. And those people still look at it that way. This is what I believe. You've got many Israeli citizens that are protesting the very things that the government is doing. But I think it's very, very important to know and to realize it is a war. It's an ongoing war. It's been fought in the shadows and in the hidden corners and kind of swept away. Everybody kind of ignores it. The European mentality, which is kind of what that gentleman was talking about, when the European mentality towards business, towards social reform, trust system that's been set up since we don't have royalty anymore.
It sounds like you're breaking up quite a bit, William, and I know you're on the road, but I think we get your point. And
I'll sign off there, but you might want to make some comments on what I said, or hopefully somebody else will. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, William. And, you're talking about Zionists, and I know that a lot of people are concerned about the behavior of the Israeli settler who seems to be acting with far more violence, especially in the aftermath of October 7th. Christina in St. Pete want to welcome you to the telephone lines, calling in the Community Speaks. Go ahead. You say what, Christina?
Happy Monday, Mobili.
Happy Monday to you.
And thank you always for your amazing show. I'm going to talk really quick, just 2 quick points, and then I'll get off the air. I'm on my super quick lunch break here. So the first thing is, as far as the book bans and banning African-American history, at least elements of it, I'm horrified. I taught for 5 years in Broward County at the beginning of my teaching career, and the first school I taught at was a predominantly black elementary school, the Arts, Elementary. Shout out to anybody that might be from Broward out there.
Yeah.
And the second school I taught at was Boyd Anderson High School. I would say about 98% African-American. And we had an abundance of Haitian students, and I was teaching theater. And, when you're a theater teacher, you get very close with the kids. You call them your kids. You're with them from 7 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night because you're doing shows. They stay after school with you. You eat together. You laugh together. You joke. And I just was horrified when this horrific thing that Trump said about Haitians eating cats and dogs. The first thing I thought of that broke my mama bear heart was my Haitian students in Broward County.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking, and I thought of them. Out of all of my students, my Haitian population was probably the most soft-spoken, the sweetest, the most eager to please their teacher, the most disciplined. Their parents were lovely, and nobody was eating cats and dogs.
Right, yeah.
So just very upset. I mean, how does anybody stop for a moment to think about how the kids feel when this stuff is going on? So, in any event, moving on, because I'll cry if I keep talking about that. But you had a caller on just a few callers ago, and he mentioned Rick Scott and why in this state do we continually keep repeating these mistakes, correct, with our elections? And, I'm just going to say, I've been seeing it go on, right? We see it. We saw Rick Scott get elected 2 times. We saw DeSantis get elected 2 times. We're never going to change the mind, I don't believe, of those hardcore Republicans that vote these people in, right? I really think that we need to change the voting culture of Florida from a grassroots level and focus on the politically apathetic voters that perhaps swing somewhere in the middle, maybe even some moderate Republicans if we're lucky enough. There is a culture of political apathy in Florida. Yeah. There really is. Nobody wants to talk about politics. Even right now, with all the excitement and terror of this impending national election, I went to the Floridian Social Club one night. I was watching the Black Honkies, my favorite band, my favorite local band, play. And I thought, and I'm an actor, so I go out and do fun things in the community and role play and act things out, and just to see what these people who I'll never run into again, what they think. And I was in the ladies' restroom, reapplying my makeup, and there was probably about a good 8 to 9 women in that bathroom at the Floridian. And I said, ladies, we're in for a treat. Let's all vote for Kamala. This is going to be great. And I just say this, the majority of women in that bathroom were white. Everybody just tensed up. Nobody said anything. One woman, this tall, beautiful white woman, I'm for Trump, and walked away. One woman in that room came up to me. She was black, and we did a high five. And I was like, oh, I don't feel alone now. My point in telling this story is even the women that obviously are not voting for Kamala, this political apathy, this refusal to even engage in discussion, it's a problem. And it affects our voting history, as we know from the last 4 gubernatorial elections in this state. And it's very disturbing, and it needs to change. So that's all I wanted to share with you. But I hope you have a wonderful Monday, and I look forward to listening to the last few minutes of your show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina, for calling. And I think you're right. I think there is too much apathy. We need to dance on the grave of apathy and get activated once again. Go ahead, Art from Largo. Thank you for calling. You say what?
Well, I say thank you for presenting Professor Finkelstein on Gaza. Most Americans have no idea of the many massacres inflicted upon the Palestinians by the Israeli offensive forces. Hamas waited until 1982 to revolt militarily as an organization against Israeli flagrant violation of Palestinian human rights. International law says the occupied people have the right to use violence, but not the occupier. The U.S. and Europe disagree, and they labeled Hamas as terrorists. So I want to thank you for a great show, Mabili.
Yeah, but thank you. Thank you for calling and making that point, Art.
You're welcome. Thank you.
813-239-9663. And some of you have all also written to dj@wmnf.org talking about some of the issues that we have raised. One of those, talking about the people that they don't believe, some of the people that we vote for in this state, responding to some of that. He said the leadership roles are not enough true Christians in society today. They don't believe in what Christ about love thy neighbor. It doesn't say love your neighbor only if they're exactly you or like you or do the same things that you do. There is no distinction. It's simply love thy neighbor. So it would be important to recognize if you call yourself a Christian, you have to be more Christ-like. Go ahead, Simon, you're on the air. You say what?
How you doing? I'll try to keep as brief as I can. A couple issues real quick. The United Nations General Assembly does not have any binding power. They just make recommendations, of which 1/3 of the General Assembly is made up of the Islamic organization. So you've got 57 nations that are going to pass a resolution against Israel. The major issue is the word Zionist, and I guess the black individual who called from the Uhuru group, the word Zionist, I guess he wouldn't appreciate what Frederick Douglass had to say, or Marcus Garvey, or Bayard Rustin, who were black Zionists, who wanted to emulate the exodus of what the Jews did. The essence of what's going on here is of power. Pre-1967, even the Nation magazine with Kirschway at the leadership of the Nation magazine in 1948 wanted to push for an Israeli state. It was after 1967 when the world realized that Israel could defend itself, and in fact there was an arms embargo by the United States within that time period from 1948 to 1967. So in essence, when you look at 2,000 years of the Jews being on the planet, 4,000 years, they come to a point now where they can defend themselves.
All right, thank you, Simon, for those comments. We're running out of time. Vasily of Largo, you might have the last word. You say what on Community Speaks?
Hello.
Yeah, hello.
My friends out there, it's sad that there's an evangelical white alignment with Israeli state powers for God knows what reasons, I don't know. But quickly, George Orwell, 1984, he was spot on, except he was off by 40 years. I took exception to one gentleman, a previous caller, in his description of whites. I would say a good half of my friends are black, and they are literate. Yeah. One friend, Jesse, told me that blacks can be the most forgiving people. I still take that part to this day. So how many times in history have illegitimate power structures begun by burning books?
Yeah.
We must think about these things. So thank you for your time.
Yeah.
And God bless everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for calling from Largo. This has been Community Speaks, and that's my time. I was interested talking to you and getting at least scratching the surface on these issues. We're going to talk more about economic issues going forward. Most Hispanic Americans support abortion access, despite the fact that there have been a lot of attempts at coming at them from the right. We're going to talk more about what the UN is talking about, world leaders trying to lay out a vision for the future that includes AI. So there's so many issues on the table, and some of the aspirations of young people around the world we're seeing play itself out with a lot of these election contests that have been taking place. So we're going to keep talking about these issues, but keep it tuned. We're going to get back to the music coming up next. Blandy Whalen is going to bring It's the Music Monday to you, and I want to thank you for your calls. I want to thank DJ Spaceship for taking your calls and keeping the show going smoothly. Thank you for that. And all of these issues we're going to continue to talk to. Hopefully we'll get some news update before we get back to the music. But thank you for tuning in to Community Speaks. I'm your host, Patro Mabili, here on this public affairs program, coming your way every Monday. So we'll be back next Monday to continue some of these discussions. Thank you for joining me. This is WMNF Tampa.
Election year. To help inform you about voting, the candidates, and the issues on the ballot, the WMNF News team has partnered with 10 other public media organizations around the state to create a 2024 Florida Voter Guide.
You can find it on our website at WMNF.org/vote. It has information about all the candidates for the U.S. Senate and House and the Florida Senate and House.
Candidates provide their positions on issues ranging from the cost of insurance to the environment to how they'll vote on the proposed constitutional amendments. You will also find a tool to help locate the district you vote